Hi, I'm Julianna Byrne, and today I'd love to take you through some of the exercises that I've been using myself during isolation to sort of unblock some creativity and kind of get me back into my practice. So I've been drawing a lot from botanical foraged material. I find it a really useful practice because I often draw and paint from my imagination and have quite a lot of sort of big ideas, and I find going outside and picking flowers, grasses, anything you can kind of get your hands on really. It doesn't have to be particularly beautiful, it can be sort of weeds or anything. I find it really grounding, and I find it really helpful to sort of switch off and hold something in your hand and draw from an object. I also think a lot of us have probably been quite glued to our phones, and I think just drawing from something that's real and natural and organic and that you can hold in your hand is a really nice practice. So you're going to need some forage material. I went outside, picked some bluebells, I picked some cow parsley, which is not quite sprouted yet, some mustard garlic, I think that's what it's called. Who knows, it might just be a weed. I've got some artichoke, the leaves of an artichoke plant, and then I've got some sort of tulips that are kind of completely on their way out, but I actually love the way flowers curl when they're drying. I think it's really beautiful to draw from. And I've got these because I know a lot of people don't have access to hedgerows and the countryside, and it might be that they are using dried flowers or things that they already had in their house. So really anything goes. The main thing here is to just have something organic and natural and draw from it. So I need you to get your forage material, go to a kitchen table or a desk or wherever you want to draw. Do what you need to do to create an atmosphere, put some relaxing music on, pour yourself a drink, light a candle, and you're going to need some materials, importantly. So I'm going to be using gouache today, which is kind of like a watercolour. It behaves in a very similar way. But if you don't have that, and I appreciate not everyone has these things lying around, any water-based paint will do. If you don't have paint, pencil's fine. We're going to be using pencil to loosen up our hands in the first exercise anyway. So the main materials are pencils, paper, paints, paintbrushes. If you don't have all those things, crayons, colouring pencils, sort of anything you can get your hands on. The main aim for this class is not to create a masterpiece that we want to have on our wall, and if you do, that's great, but it's to unwind and enjoy the creative process. So I hope you enjoy. Okay, so we're set up. Useful to mention, have some vases, glasses or jars of water. This is just to dilute your paints when we eventually use them. The paper I'm using today is watercolour paper, which if you want to continue to do exercises like this, it's definitely worth investing in some. I think you can buy them online at the moment. Amazon is still delivering them. But honestly, today I think is more important just to loosen up our hands, as I said before, so don't worry if you don't have the highest grade paper or paints or anything like that. So I'm going to start with this artichoke leaf, which I love. I'm going to take one of the leaves off. Sometimes it's quite nice just to study it a little bit, just to look at the anatomy, just the way it works. Some of you might be quite sort of detailed people who like looking at detail, and some of you might sort of want to paint the bigger picture. So I'm going to kind of explore a bit of both today, but yeah, the first exercise is to just loosen up our hands. So let's go. I find it useful to follow the middle vein of the plant. It kind of feels like the natural way a plant would grow. So here we go. I'm going to draw as many times as I can in a short amount of time this leaf. Don't worry too much about what you're creating here. You're probably not going to look at these drawings again. It's just, it's a way of loosening up your sort of flow and just trying to like care a little bit less. Now I'm actually going to try the whole plant. So this is a really beautiful kind of quite curly, frondy plant. So I'm going to draw it now in a way that I care less about the detail and kind of look at it as a bigger picture. Again, it's really helpful just so what you create does look like a plant. It's just to map out that middle section and the way it goes. And then from here, once you have this, you can kind of use it as a map to kind of unleash all the other sort of frondy, curly bits without going too off course. So I'm going to start from the bottom. Again, when you're drawing the leaves, you can pull out this middle vein as a map and come off it. So and what's really helpful sometimes is to try not to, with each section, try not to let your hand come off the paper. Try not to let your pencil come away from the paper. It kind of, it encourages the drawing to flow, the lines to flow, and it also kind of means you have to care a little bit less. I'm actually coming off the side of the paper now. Getting a little bit too big. Don't worry if it looks like a confusing blur of lines. But what's really happening here is that you're kind of learning the rhythm of the plant that you've got in front of you. The way it grows, the way it's folding out, the way it's falling. And that's a really nice base in order, if you do want to go on and paint from it, it's really nice to sort of understand the nature of it. So next I'm going to take one of the sort of dried tulips, or the drying tulips. As I mentioned before, when flowers start to sort of deteriorate, the colours can get quite rich and the petals can curl in a way that is just really quite beautiful to draw. It makes for quite a delicate shape. And I think they're kind of slightly more interesting to draw and paint than a flower in full bloom. So let's take this one, for example. Actually, let's take this one. So the petals are kind of all going in different directions, and when you look at it, it makes sense that it's a flower, but really when you draw it, it's going to have lots of curls and lots of different sort of layers. And again, using this stem to kind of create a map which is going to let the eye realise that what you're drawing is a flower is a really useful tool. So we're going to start by just laying that down there, I think. And I'm just going to draw quite boldly that middle stem. I'm going to give it proper shape here. From here, I'm going to add a little bit of shadow, but again, nothing too detailed. Just to give it a little bit of form. From here I'm going to draw this leaf, which is really curly and quite beautiful. And it comes over the top, so I'm holding the pencil in a way that quite loosely, sort of letting it do its thing, and if it kind of wobbles off course, it kind of almost works quite well because this flower is sort of going on all sorts of different directions. So I'm being kind of almost letting the pencil sort of draw before I control it, if that makes any sense. Add a little bit of form to this here. Again, I'm being not being particularly delicate here at all. Again, that pencil really went on off on its own course just then, but it kind of doesn't matter. You can bring it back in with the shadowing and... Okay, so here's for the petals. Just accentuating that curl. And then it kind of comes over the top like that, so the petal folds out. You can see how I'm kind of holding the pencil in all sorts of weird ways. This is again just to hammer home the fact that I'm kind of trying to trust in the materials I'm using. So now that we've studied the anatomy and the finer details of the plants we're drawing from, a really nice exercise in order to get into using paint is to paint the flower or the plant in one colour. I find it quite a useful exercise because we've spent some time looking at the kind of structure of the plant in different sections. I find it quite a useful exercise in order to look at the plant in one object, and by taking out the details of the different colours, it helps you to see the plant in one form, which can be quite helpful when painting because it just helps with the flow. So I'm going to use a medium-sized brush here, and I'm going to use a indigo gouache paint, but you can use anything you like, any colour you like. Again, watercolours are also really helpful if you don't have your gouache, and also if you're choosing to stick with pencil or coloured pencil, that's also completely fine. But here we go. So I'm going to start with that central vein. I'm going to do one up here. For the leaves, I'm going to apply with the same colour, but with more water first. So you might not be able to see clearly, but I'm adding a kind of layer of water here. And then on top of that, I'm going to sort of drop in with the same brush the gouache paint, and as you can see, it kind of has this really lovely bleeding effect. Same goes for the other leaf. As you can see, I've kind of made a mistake here and ended up dragging some of the stem into the leaf, but again, it doesn't really matter because what's happening here is actually really quite lovely. With the petals, I'm actually going to use a slightly bigger brush this time, just because they're kind of so wide. And I'm going to use that same technique where I apply some water first. Water with a little bit of paint in it, just so you can see where you're adding this water. I'm going to do a big kind of blob here. And then the darkest part of the leaf is in this curl round, so I'm just going to very lightly add some blue to the tip of the paintbrush and sort of from the top of that water blob. Don't think I'm using particularly professional terminology here. You can kind of bring the colour down. Let's go for the second sort of tulip leaf. So I'm not focusing too much on the perspective here. I'm just going to drop random blobs of this really rich blue into the water. And as you can see, it kind of the paint starts to do the hard work for you. It starts to create those shadows. It starts to, just going to bring that round in a little curl there. It starts to create those shadows and kind of create that natural decaying. So I think that's done now. Like I don't like to overwork these sketches. Also with this kind of paper and this kind of paint, these areas will continue to bleed, and when they dry they'll continue to take sort of new form. So you might go back to this in 10 minutes and it might look, well, not completely different, but it will look different. So my advice is to not overwork things, not think too hard, and move on to the next. So let's take this one here, for example. This one's a little bit older, a little bit more sort of gnarly. So let's take that medium brush. I'm going to do this one really quickly. Dropping this colour into this watery kind of stem, and it's really bleeding quite beautifully. For the flowers, these petals are less thick, so I'm going to use this same brush here. I'm going to again apply some water first, but I'm going to do this quite quickly, and then I'm going to drop in the colour quite quickly and just see what happens. It might not look good. It might look good. It doesn't matter if you few spillages. This is a really kind of complicated and sort of quite gnarly plant that we've got here, so anything kind of goes. There's a lot of little curly endings, so when I drop the blue, I'm kind of trying to encourage the bleed of the ink to go in a curl. The trick is knowing when to stop. Again, same as we did with the pencil, really let the paintbrushes kind of do the hard work for you, and then you're sort of dropping in these accents of colour and letting the ink play on the water to kind of pull in that form. And those are really simple, and I'm going to leave them now because I think they're going to bleed out in their own way. And I think the next step is to move on to using colour. So now I'm going to continue with the paints. I'm going to use one of my artichoke leaves and one of my dried tulips. I'm going to paint them in their actual colours this time because I think they're really beautiful, and I also think that where these colours are sort of bleeding into one another, it could be really interesting to use that play of water and droplets of paint that we've been using to kind of get that effect, get that sort of bleed effect. So I'm going to start with the artichoke leaf, and I'm going to use the same kind of system where I start with the central vein and then kind of pull the leaves off. Again, I don't want to be too heavy on the paint because it's nice to go back in. It's best not to plan out anything when you're drawing these. Just keep going. Try not to care too much. Just look at the plant as a whole and just try and get that rhythm. Not every leaf's going to be the same, but you're just trying to get the sort of the flow of it. The good thing about using lots of water is that there's lots of room for mistakes. I think mistakes are actually really important, but if there's something that you really don't like, you can kind of go over it and push it around with the water and the paint and kind of change its form a little bit. Don't worry too much about it looking exactly like what's you know, no one's going to hold you up as a botanical illustrator here. There we go. So, what's great about this is I'm just going to use this paintbrush that has been in the blue. I'm just going to add in some shadows here. Some of this, if you're quick enough, some of the bottom leaves won't be dry properly, so you can kind of pull in, get thicker daubs of paint and just sort of blob things around, see what works. I'm completely making this up as I go along. But the beauty of it is that it's all quite absorbent, this material, so this paper. So you can really just like have a go. If you don't like something, if you don't like something, like you put something on too heavy, just grab some water, get some water. I mean, I actually quite like that now, but you could get some water and just pull it over the top, kind of loosens it up a bit. And I'm just going to add some shadow down the bottom here. And into the kind of stem, just because that is where the darkest areas are for me when I'm looking at this plant. And it just adds that form that we talked about at the beginning. I think that's done. I don't think I need to overwork this one. I think that's really simple. And I quite like the way that it fills most of the page. And it kind of doesn't necessarily look exactly like this, but it kind of captures the main essence of it. So now I'm going to paint this dried tulip. I'm going to try and get these beautiful colours in here. So I've got a really lovely raw sienna here and a crimson colour, and then the same green as before for the stem. So same story as before for the stem. Hopefully we're getting good at this now. Not too much thought. Just pull up that sort of straight line, not too high because you want to have room for your lovely colours up here. And then sort of apply quite a large bit of water for here. Again, we're letting this ink sort of take the form. Letting the paint, create the form for us without having to think too hard. Okay, so for these petals I'm going to use this quite nice thick brush. Just going to get some of the water out of it. You'll see I've changed my water to clean water. It's quite good to do this because otherwise you kind of end up getting quite muddy colours. So here we go. I'm going to go in with the yellow first, with the goldy colour first, because it seems like that's the base colour of these petals, and the kind of that red tone seems to sort of come in at the top of the petals. If you start thinking too hard about the form of the flower, you'll get confused. There's no way I could draw this completely lifelike. Some people can. I actually think there's quite a lot of charm in it being kind of all sort of loose and a bit bedraggled. Here we go. So, without letting that dry too much, I'm going to take this crimson on the same brush actually, and I'm going to start to, oh, that worked really nicely. I'm going to start to add it in. I think I might have a little bit too much of that crimson on there. But I can take some of it off and then sort of pull it round. Pull those colours round. Again, these are gonna change form quite a lot before your eyes, so don't add too much. It's tempting to kind of colour in, but really once you drop on these little blobs, they kind of start to bleed all together. And I'm actually gonna take a new brush here, quite a delicate one, if I can find it. Yeah, with a nice point. It's got a bit of green on it, which is actually no bad thing because there is a bit of green coming through here from the stem. And I'm gonna pull very carefully, I'm going to pull some of this up to the top. The beauty of having so much water before you apply your paint is that you can kind of push and manipulate the colours around. And I'm going to stop there because it's really tempting to overwork something, and I actually think that's really simple. And again, we're not trying to get something that's completely perfect and lifelike here. We're just trying to sort of get the essence of the flowers.